This is a LibriVox recording. For more information, please visit librivox.blogsome.com. Today's reading by Hugh, McGuire. The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, Chapter 4. Most of the 30 or so little tables, covered by red cloths with a white design, stood ranged at right angles to the deep brown wainscoting of the underground hall. Bronze chandeliers with many globes depended from the low, slightly vaulted ceiling, and the fresco paintings ran flat and dull all around the walls without windows, representing scenes of the chase and of outdoor revelry in medieval costumes. Varlets in green jerkins brandished hunting knives and raised on high tankers of foaming beer. "Unless I am very much mistaken, you are the man who would know the inside of this confounded affair," said the robust Ossipon, leaning over, his elbows far out on the table and his feet tucked back completely under his chair, his eyes with wild green eagerness. An upright, semi-ground piano near the door, flanked by two palms in pots, executed suddenly, all by itself, a waltz tune with aggressive virtuosity. The din it raised was deafening. When it ceased, as abruptly as it had started, the bespectacled, dingy little man who faced Ossipon behind a heavy glass mug full of beer emitted calmly what had the sound of a general proposition. "In principle, what one of us may or may not know as to any given fact can't be a matter for inquiry to the others." "Certainly not," Comrade Ossipon agreed in a quiet undertone. "In principle." With his big, florid face held between his hands, he continued to stare hard, while the dingy little man in spectacles coolly took a drink of beer and stood the glass mug back on the table. His flat, large ears departed widely from the sides of his skull, which looked frail enough for Ossipon to crush between thumb and forefinger. The dome of the forehead seemed to rest on the rim of the spectacles. The flat cheeks of a greasy, unhealthy complexion were merely smudged by the miserable poverty of a thin, dark whisker. The lamentable inferiority of the whole physique was made ludicrous by the supremely self-confident bearing of the individual. His speech was curt, and he had a particularly impressive manner of keeping silent. Ossipon spoke again from between his hands in a mutter. "Have you been out much today?" "No, I stayed in bed all the morning," answered the other. "Why?" "Oh, nothing," said Ossipon, gazing earnestly, and quivering inwardly with the desire to find out something, but obviously intimidated by the little man's overwhelming air of unconcern. When talking with this comrade, which happened but rarely, the big Ossipon suffered from a sense of moral and even physical insignificance. However, he ventured another question. "Did you walk down here?" "No, omnibus," the little man answered readily enough. He lived far away in Islington, in a small house down a shabby street, littered with straw and dirty paper, where out of school hours a troop of assorted children ran and squabbled with a shrill, joyless, rowdy clamour. His single back room, remarkable for having an extremely large cupboard, he rented furnished from two elderly spinsters, dressmakers in a humble way, with a clientele of servant girls mostly. He had a heavy padlock put on the cupboard, but otherwise he was a model lodger, giving no trouble and requiring practically no attendance. His oddities were that he insisted on being present when his room was being swept, and that when he went out he locked his door and took the key away with him. Ossipon had a vision of these round, black-rimmed spectacles progressing along the street on top of an omnibus, their self-confident glitter falling here and there on the walls of houses or lowered upon the heads of the unconscious stream of people on the pavements. The ghost of a sickly smile altered the set of Osippon's thick lips as he thought of the walls nodding, of people running for life at the sight of those spectacles. If they had only known. What panic! He murmured interrogatively, "Been sitting long here?" "An hour or more," answered the other negligently, and took a pull at the dark beer. All his movements, the way he grasped the mug, the act of drinking, the way he set the heavy glass down and folded his arms, had a firmness, an assured precision, which made the big and muscular Ossipon, leaning forward with staring eyes and protruding lips, look the picture of eager indecision. "An hour?" he said. "Then it may be you haven't heard yet the news I've heard just now in the street, have you?" The little man shook his head negatively, the least bit. But as he gave no indication of curiosity, Ossipon ventured to add that he had heard it just outside the place. A newspaper boy had yelled the thing under his very nose, and not being prepared for anything of the sort, he was very much startled and upset. He had to come in there with a dry mouth. "I never thought of finding you here," he added, murmuring steadily, with his elbows planted on the table. "I come here sometimes," said the other, preserving his provoking coolness of demeanour. "It's wonderful that you, of all people, should have heard nothing of it," the big Ossipon continued. His eyelids snapped nervously upon the shining eyes. "You, of all people," he repeated tentatively. This obvious restraint argued an incredible and inexplicable timidity of the big fellow before the calm little man, who again lifted the glass mug, drank, and put it down with brusque and assured movements. And that was all. Ossipon, after waiting for something, word or sign, that did not come, made an effort to assume a sort of indifference. "Do you," he said, deadening his voice still more, "give your stuff to anybody who's asking for it?" "My absolute rule is never to refuse anyone, as long as I have a pinch by me," answered the little man with decision. "That's a principle?" commented Ossipon. "It's a principle." "And you think it's sound?" The large round spectacles, which gave a look of staring self-confidence to the sallow face, confronted Ossipon like sleepless, unwinking orbs flashing a cold fire. "Perfectly. Always. Under every circumstance. What could stop me? Why should I not? Why should I think twice about it?" Ossipon gasped, as it were, discreetly. "Do you mean to say you would hand it over to a tech if one came to ask you for your wares?" The other smiled faintly. "Let them come and try it on, and you will see," he said. "They know me, but I know also every one of them. They won't come near me, not they." His thin, livid lips snapped together firmly. Ossipon began to argue. "But they could send someone, rig a plant on you, don't you see? Get the stuff from you in that way, and then arrest you with the proof in their hands." "Proof of what? Dealing in explosives without a license, perhaps." This was meant for a contemptuous jeer, though the expression of the thin, sickly face remained unchanged, and the utterance was negligent. "I don't think there's one of them anxious to make that arrest. I don't think they could get one of them to apply for a warrant. I mean one of the best, not one." "Why?" Ossipon asked. "Because they know very well I take care never to part with the last handful of my wares. I've it always by me." He touched the breast of his coat lightly. "In a thick glass flask," he added. "So I've been told," said Ossipon with a shade of wonder in his voice. "But I didn't know if they know," interrupted the little man crisply, leaning against the straight chair back which rose higher than his fragile head. "I shall never be arrested. The game isn't good enough for any policeman of them all. To deal with a man like me requires sheer, naked, inglorious heroism." Again his lips closed with a self-confident snap. Ossipon repressed a movement of impatience. "Or recklessness, or simply ignorance," he retorted. They've only got to get somebody for the job who does not know you carry enough stuff in your pocket to blow yourself and everything within 60 yards of you to pieces." "I never affirmed I could not be eliminated," rejoined the other. "But that wouldn't be an arrest. Moreover, it's not as easy as it looks." "Bah!" Ossipon contradicted. "Don't be too sure of that. What's to prevent a half-dozen of them jumping upon you from behind in the street? With your arms pinned to your sides, you could do nothing, could you?" "Yes, I could. I'm seldom out in the streets after dark," said the little man impassively. "And never very late. I walk always with my right hand closed around the India rubber ball which I have in my trouser pocket. The pressing of this ball actuates a detonator inside the flask I carry in my pocket. It's the principle of the pneumatic instantaneous shutter for a camera lens. The tube leads up." With a swift disclosing gesture he gave Ossipon a glimpse of an India rubber tube, resembling a slender brown worm issuing from the armhole of his waistcoat and plunging into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. His clothes of a nondescript brown mixture were threadbare and marked with stains, dusty in the folds, with rugged buttonholes. "The detonator is partly mechanical, partly chemical," he explained with casual condescension. "It is instantaneous, of course," murmured Ossipon with a slight shudder. "Far from it," confessed the other with a reluctance which seemed to twist his mouth dolorously. "A full 20 seconds must elapse from the moment I press the ball till the explosion takes place." "Whew!" whistled Ossipon, completely appalled. 20 seconds? Horrors! You mean to say you could face that? I should go crazy." "Wouldn't matter if you did. Of course it's the weak point of this special system, which is only for my own use. The worst is that the manner of exploding is always the weak point with us. I'm trying to invent a detonator that would adjust itself to all conditions of action, and even to unexpected changes of conditions. A variable and yet perfectly precise mechanism. A really intelligent detonator." 20 seconds, muttered Ossipon again. "Oh, and then?" With a slight turn of the head, the glitter of the spectacles seemed to gauge the size of the beer saloon in the basement of the renowned Silenus restaurant. Nobody in this room could hope to escape, was the verdict of that survey. Nor yet this couple going up the stairs now. The piano at the foot of the staircase clanged through a mazurka with brazen impetuosity, as though a vulgar and impudent ghost were showing off. The keys sank and rose mysteriously. Then all became still. For a moment Ossipon imagined the overlighted place changed into a dreadful black hole belching horrible fumes, choked with ghastly rubbish of smashed brickwork and mutilated corpses. He had such a distinct perception of ruin and death that he shuddered again. The other observed with an air of calm sufficiency. In the last instance, it is character alone that makes for one's safety. There are very few people in the world whose character is as well established as mine. "I wonder how you managed it," growled Ossipon. "Force of personality," said the other without raising his voice. And coming from the mouth of that obviously miserable organism, the assertion caused the robust Ossipon to bite his lower lip. "Force of personality," he repeated with ostentatious calm. "I have the means to make myself deadly, but that by itself, you understand, is absolutely nothing in the way of protection. What is effective is the belief those people have in my will to use the means. That's their impression. It is absolute. Therefore, I am deadly." "There are individuals of character amongst that lot, too," muttered Ossipon ominously. "Possibly. But it is a matter of degree, obviously, since, for instance, I am not impressed by them. Therefore they are inferior. They cannot be otherwise. Their character is built upon conventional morality. It leans on the social order. Mine stands free from everything artificial. They are bound in all sorts of conventions. They depend on life, which in this connection is a historical fact surrounded by all sorts of restraints and considerations, a complex, organized fact open to attack at every point. Whereas I depend on death, which knows no restraint and cannot be attacked. My superiority is evident. This is a transcendental way of putting it, said Ossipon, watching the cold glitter of the round spectacles. I've heard Carl Jung say much the same thing not very long ago. Carl Jung, mumbled the other contemptuously. The delegate of the International Red Committee has been a posturing shadow all his life. There are 3 of you delegates, aren't there? I won't define the other 2, as you are one of them. But what you say means nothing. You are the worthy delegates for revolutionary propaganda, but the trouble is not only that you are as unable to think independently as any respectable grocer or journalist of them all, but that you have no character whatsoever. Ossipon could not restrain a start of indignation. But what do you want from us? He exclaimed in a deadened voice. What is it you are after yourself? A perfect detonator was the peremptory answer. What are you making that face for? You see, you can't even bear the mention of something conclusive. I'm not making a face, growled the annoyed Ossipon bearishly. You revolutionaries, the other continued with leisurely self-confidence, are the slaves of social convention which is afraid of you, slaves of it as much as the very police that stand up in the defense of that convention. Clearly you are, since you want to revolutionize it. It governs your thoughts, of course, and your action too, and thus neither your thoughts nor your action can ever be conclusive. He paused, tranquil with that air of close, endless silence, then almost immediately went on. You are not a bit better than the forces arrayed against you, than the police, for instance. The other day I came suddenly upon Chief Inspector Heat at the corner of Tottenham Court Road. He looked at me very steadily, but I did not look at him. Why should I give him more than a glance? He was thinking of many things, of his superiors, of his reputation, of the law courts, of his salary, of the newspapers, of 100 things, but I was thinking of my perfect detonator only. He meant nothing to me. He was as significant as... I can't call to mind anything insignificant enough to compare him with, except Carl Jung, perhaps. Like to like. The terrorist and the policeman both come from the same basket. Revolution, legality, countermoves in the same game, forms of idleness at the bottom. Identical. He plays his little game, so do you propagandists, but I don't play. I work 14 hours a day and go hungry sometimes. My experiments cost money now and again. And then I must do without food for a day or 2. You are looking at my beer. Yes, I've had 2 glasses already, and shall have another presently. This is a little holiday, and I celebrate it alone. Why not? I've the grit to work alone, quite alone, absolutely alone. I've worked alone for years. Ossipon's face had turned a dusky red. At the perfect detonator, eh? He sneered very low. Yes, retorted the other. It is a good definition. You couldn't find anything half so precise to define the nature of your activity, with all your committees and delegations. It is I who am the true propagandist. We won't discuss that point, said Ossipon, with an air of rising above personal considerations. I'm afraid I'll have to spoil your holiday for you, though. There's a man blown up in Greenwich Park this morning. How do you know? They've been yelling the news in the streets since 2 o'clock. I bought the paper and just ran in here. Then I saw you sitting at this table. I've got it in my pocket now. He pulled the newspaper out. It was a good-sized, rosy sheet, as if flushed by the warmth of its own convictions, which were optimistic. He scanned the pages rapidly. Ah, here it is. Bomb in Greenwich Park. There isn't much so far. 11:30, foggy morning, effects of explosion felt as far as Romney Road and Park Place. Enormous hole in the ground under a tree filled with smashed roots and broken branches. All round fragments of a man's body blown to pieces. That's all. The rest's mere newspaper gup. No doubt a wicked attempt to blow up the observatory, they say. That's hardly credible. He looked at the paper for a while longer in silence, then passed it to the other, who, after gazing abstractly at the print, laid it down without comment. It was Ossipon who spoke first, still resentful. The fragments of only one man, you note. Ergo, he blew himself up. That spoils your day off for you, don't it? Were you expecting that sort of move? I hadn't the slightest idea, not the ghost of a notion of anything of the sort being planned to come off here, in this country. Under the present circumstance, it's nothing short of criminal. The little man lifted his thin black eyebrows with dispassionate scorn. Criminal? What is that? What is crime? What can be the meaning of such an assertion? How am I to express myself? One must use the current words, said Ossipon impatiently. The meaning of this assertion is that this business may affect our position very adversely in this country. Isn't that crime enough for you? I am convinced you have been giving away some of your stuff lately. Ossipon stared hard. The other, without flinching, lowered and raised his head slowly. You have, burst out the editor of the FP leaflets in an intense whisper. No. And are you really handing it over at large like this, for the asking, to the first fool who comes along? Just so. The condemned social order has not been built up on paper and ink, and I don't fancy that a combination of paper and ink will ever put an end to it, whatever you may think. Yes, I would give the stuff with both hands to every man, woman, or fool that likes to come along. I know what you are thinking about, but I am not taking my cue from the Red Committee. I would see you all hounded out of here, or arrested, or beheaded for that matter, without turning a hair. What happens to us as individuals is not of the least consequence. He spoke carelessly, without heat, almost without feeling, and Ossipon, secretly much affected, tried to copy this detachment. If the police here knew their business, they would shoot you full of holes with revolvers, or else try to sandbag you from behind in broad daylight. The little man seemed already to have considered that point of view in his dispassionate, self-confident manner. Yes, he assented with the utmost readiness. But for that they would have to face their own institutions. Do you see? That requires grit. Uncommon grit. Grit of a special kind. Ossipon blinked. I fancy that's exactly what would happen to you if you were to set up your laboratory in the States. They don't stand on ceremony with their institutions there. I am not likely to go and see. Otherwise your remark is just, admitted the other. They have more character over there, and their character is essentially anarchistic. Fertile ground for us, the States, very good ground. The great Republic has the root of the destructive matter in her. The collective temperament is lawless, excellent. They must shoot us down. But you are too transcendental for me, growled Ossipon with moody concern. Logical, protested the other. There are several kinds of logic. This is the enlightened kind. America is all right. It is this country that is dangerous, with her idealistic conception of legality. The social spirit of this people is wrapped up in scrupulous prejudices, and that is fatal to our work. You talk of England being our only refuge. So much the worse. Capoi! What do we want with refuges? Here you talk, print, plot, and do nothing. I dare say it's very convenient for such Karl Yunts. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, then added with the same leisurely assurance, to break up the superstition and worship of legality should be our aim. Nothing would please me more than to see Inspector Heat and his likes take to shooting us down in broad daylight with the approval of the public. Half our battle would be won then. disintegration of the old morality would have set in its very temple. That is what you ought to aim at. But you revolutionaries will never understand that. You plan the future, you lose yourselves in reveries of economical systems derived from what is, whereas what's wanted is a clean sweep and a clear start for a new conception of life. That sort of future will take care of itself if you will only make room for it. Therefore I would shovel my stuff in heaps at the corners of the street if I had enough for that, and as I haven't, I do my best by perfecting a really dependable detonator. Ossipon, who had been mentally swimming in deep waters, seized upon the last words as if it were a saving plank. Yes, your detonators. I shouldn't wonder if it was one of your detonators that made a clean sweep of the man in the park. A shade of vexation darkened the determined sallow face confronting Ossipon. My difficulty consists precisely in experimenting practically with the various kinds. They must be tried, after all. Besides, Ossipon interrupted. Who could that fellow be? I assure you that we in London had no knowledge. Couldn't you describe the person you gave the stuff to? The other turned his spectacles upon Ossipon like a pair of searchlights. Describe him, he repeated slowly. I don't think there can be the slightest objection now. I will describe him to you in one word. Verloc. Ossipon, whom curiosity had lifted a few inches off his seat, dropped back, as if hit in the face. Verloc? Impossible! The self-possessed little man nodded slightly once. Yes, he's the person. You can't say that in this case I was giving my stuff to the first fool that came along. He was a prominent member of the group, as far as I understand. Yes, said Ossipon. Prominent? No, not exactly. He was the centre for general intelligence and usually received comrades coming over here. More useful than important. Man of no ideas. Years ago he used to speak at meetings, in France, I believe. Not very well, though. He was trusted by such men as Latour, Moser, and that old lot. The only talent he showed really was his ability to elude the attentions of the police somehow. Here, for instance, he did not seem to be looked after very closely. He was regularly married, you know. I suppose it's with her money that he started that shop. Seemed to make it pay, too. Ossipon paused abruptly, muttered to himself, I wonder what that woman will do now, and fell into thought. The other waited with ostentatious indifference. His parentage was obscure, and he was generally known only by the nickname of the Professor. His title to that designation consisted in his having been once assistant demonstrator in chemistry at some technical institute. He quarrelled with the authorities upon a question of unfair treatment. Afterwards he obtained a post in the laboratory of a manufactory of dyes. There, too, he had been treated with revolting injustice. His struggles, his privations, his hard work to raise himself in the social scale had filled him with such an exalted conviction of his merits that it was extremely difficult for the world to treat him with justice, the standard of that notion depending so much upon the patience of the individual. The Professor had genius, but lacked the great social virtue of resignation. Intellectually a nonentity, Ossipon pronounced aloud, abandoning suddenly the inward contemplation of Mrs. Verloc's bereaved person and business. Quite an ordinary personality. You were wrong in not keeping more in touch with the comrades, Professor, he added in a reproving tone. Did he say anything to you? Give you some idea of his intentions? I hadn't seen him for a month. It seems impossible that he should be gone. He told me it was going to be a demonstration against a building, said the Professor. I had known that much to prepare the missile. I pointed out to him that I had hardly a sufficient quantity for a completely destructive result, but he pressed me very earnestly to do my best. As he wanted something that could be carried openly in the hand, I proposed to make use of an old 1-gallon copal varnish can I happened to have by me. He was pleased at the idea. It gave me some trouble because I had to cut out the bottom first and solder it on again afterwards. When prepared for use, the can enclosed a wide-mouthed, well-coked jar of thick glass packed round with some wet clay containing 16 ounces of X2 green powder. The detonator was connected with the screw-top of the can. It was ingenious, a combination of time and shock. I explained the system to him. It was a thin tube of tin enclosing. Ossipon's attention wandered. "What do you think has happened?" he interrupted. "Can't tell. Screwed the top on tight, which would make the connection, and then forgot the time. It was set for 20 minutes. On the other hand, the time contact being made, a sharp shock would bring about the explosion at once. He either ran the time too close or simply let the thing fall. The contact was made all right. That's clear to me at any rate. The system worked perfectly. And yet you would think that a common fool in a hurry would be much more likely to forget to make the contact altogether. I was worrying myself about that sort of failure mostly. But there are more kinds of fools than one can guard against. You can't expect a detonator to be absolutely foolproof." He beckoned a waiter. Ossipon sat rigid with the abstracted gaze of mental travail. After the man had gone away with the money, he roused himself with an air of profound dissatisfaction. "It's extremely unpleasant for me," he mused. "Carl has been in bed with bronchitis for a week. There's an even chance that he will never get up again. Michaelis is luxuriating in the country somewhere. A fashionable publisher has offered him £500 for a book. It will be a ghastly failure. He has lost the habit of consecutive thinking in prison, you know." The professor, on his feet, now buttoning his coat, looked about him with perfect indifference. "What are you going to do?" asked Ossipon warily. He dreaded the blame of the Central Red Committee, a body which had no permanent place of abode, and whose membership he was not exactly informed. If this affair eventuated in the stoppage of the modest subsidy allotted for the publication of the F.P. pamphlets, then indeed he would have to regret Verloc's inexplicable folly. "Solidarity with the extremest form of action is one thing, and silly recklessness is another," he said, with a sort of moody brutality. "I don't know what came to Verloc. There's some mystery here. However, he's gone. You may take it as you like, but under the circumstances the only policy for the militant revolutionary group is to disclaim all connection with this damned freak of yours. How to make the disclaimer convincing enough is what bothers me." The little man on his feet, buttoned up and ready to go, was no taller than the seated Ossipon. He levelled his spectacles at the latter's face point blank. "You might ask the police for a testimonial of good conduct. They know where every one of you slept last night. Perhaps if you asked them, they would consent to publish some sort of official statement." "No doubt they're aware well enough that we had nothing to do with this," mumbled Ossipon bitterly. "What they will say is another thing." He remained thoughtful, disregarding the short, owlish, shabby figure standing by his side. "I must lay hands on Michaelis at once and get him to speak from his heart at one of our gatherings. The public has a sort of sentimental regard for that fellow. His name is known, and I am in touch with a few reporters on the big dailies. What he would say would be utter bosh, but he has a turn of talk that makes it go down all the same." "Like treacle," interjected the professor, rather low, keeping an impassive expression. The perplexed Ossipon went on communing with himself half audibly, after the manner of a man reflecting in perfect solitude. "Confounded ass to leave such an imbecile business on my hands. And I don't even know if—" He sat with compressed lips. The idea of going for news straight to the shop lacked charm. His notion was that Verloc's shop might have been turned already into a police trap. They will be bound to make some arrests, he thought, with something resembling virtuous indignation. For the even tenor of his revolutionary life was menaced by no fault of his. And yet, unless he went there, he ran the risk of remaining in ignorance of what perhaps it would be very material for him to know. Then he reflected that if the man in the park had been so very much blown to pieces as the evening paper said, he could not have been identified. And if so, the police could have no special reason for watching Verloc's shop more closely than any other place known to be frequented by marked anarchists. No more reason, in fact, than for watching the doors of the Silenus. There would be a lot of watching all round, no matter where he went, still. "I wonder what I had better do now," he muttered, taking counsel with himself. A rasping voice at his elbow said with sedate scorn, "Fasten yourself upon the woman for all she is worth." After uttering these words, the Professor walked away from the table. Ossipon, whom that piece of insight had taken unawares, gave one ineffectual start, and remained still, with a helpless gaze, as though nailed fast to the seat of his chair. The lonely piano, without as much as a music stool to help it, struck a few chords courageously, and beginning a selection of national airs, played him out at last to the tune of Bluebells of Scotland. The painfully detached notes grew faint behind his back, while he went slowly upstairs, across the hall, and into the street. In front of the great doorway a dismal row of newspaper sellers standing clear of the pavement dealt out their wares from the gutter. It was a raw, gloomy day of the early spring, and the grimy sky, the mud of the streets, the rags of the dirty men, harmonized excellently with the eruption of the damp, rubbishy sheets of paper soiled with printer's ink. The posters, maculated with filth, garnished like tapestry the sweep of the curbstone. The trade in afternoon papers was brisk, yet in comparison with the swift, constant march of foot traffic, the effect was of indifference, of a disregarded distribution. Ossipon looked hurriedly both ways before stepping out into the cross-currents, but the Professor was already out of sight. End of chapter 4.
This is a LibriVox recording. For more information, please visit librivox.blogsome.com. The following recording is in the public domain. Today's reading by Branko Colin. The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 5. The Professor had turned into a street to the left, and walked along, with his head carried rigidly erect, in a crowd whose every individual almost overtopped his stunted stature. It was vain to pretend to himself that he was not disappointed, that was mere feeling. The stoicism of his thought could not be disturbed by this or any other failure. Next time, or the time after next, a telling stroke would be delivered, something really startling. A blow fit to open the first crack in the imposing front of the great edifice of legal conceptions sheltering the atrocious injustice of society. Of humble origin, and with an appearance really so mean as to stand in the way of his considerable natural abilities, his imagination had been fired early by the tales of men rising from the depth of poverty to positions of authority and affluence. The extreme, almost ascetic purity of his thought, combined with an astounding ignorance of worldly conditions, had set before him a goal of power and prestige to be attained without the medium of arts, graces, tact, wealth, by sheer weight of merit alone. On that view, he considered himself entitled to undisputed success. His father, a delicate dark enthusiast with a sloping forehead, had been an itinerant and rousing preacher of some obscure but rigid Christian sect, a man supremely confident in the privileges of his righteousness. In the son, individualist by temperament, once the science of colleges had replaced thoroughly the faith of conventicles, this moral attitude translated itself into a frenzied puritanism of ambition. He nursed it as something secularly holy. To see it thwarted opened his eyes to the true nature of the world, whose morality was artificial, corrupt, and blasphemous. The way of even the most justifiable revolutions is prepared by personal impulses disguised into creeds. The professor's indignation found in itself a final cause that absolved him from the sin of turning to destruction as the agent of his ambition. To destroy public faith in legality was the imperfect formula of his pedantic fanaticism. But the subconscious conviction that the framework of an established social order cannot be effectually shattered except by some form of collective or individual violence was precise and correct. He was a moral agent that was settled in his mind. By exercising his agency with ruthless defiance, he procured for himself the appearances of power and personal prestige. That was undeniable to his vengeful bitterness. It pacified its unrest, and in their own way the most ardent of revolutionaries are perhaps doing no more but seeking for peace in common with the rest of mankind, the peace of soothed vanity, of satisfied appetites, or perhaps of appeased conscience. Lost in the crowd, miserable and undersized, he meditated confidently on his power, keeping his hand in the left pocket of his trousers, grasping lightly the India rubber ball, the supreme guarantee of his sinister freedom. But after a while he became disagreeably affected by the sight of the roadway thronged with vehicles and of the pavement crowded with men and women. He was in a long, straight street, peopled by a mere fraction of an immense multitude, but all round him, on and on, even to the limits of the horizon hidden by the enormous piles of bricks, he felt the mass of mankind, mighty in its numbers. They swarmed numerous like locusts, industrious like ants, thoughtless like a natural force, pushing on blind and orderly and absorbed, impervious to sentiment, to logic, to terror too, perhaps. That was the form of doubt he feared most, impervious to fear. Often, while walking abroad, when he happened also to come out of himself, he had such moments of dreadful, insane mistrust of mankind. What if nothing could move them? Such moments came to all men whose ambition aims at a direct grasp upon humanity, to artists, politicians, thinkers, reformers, or saints. A despicable emotional state this, against which solitude fortifies a superior character. And with severe exultation the professor thought of the refuge of his room, with its padlocked cupboard, lost in a wilderness of poor houses, the hermitage of the perfect anarchist. In order to reach sooner the point where he could take his omnibus, he turned brusquely out of the popular street into a narrow and dusky alley paved with flagstones. On one side, the low brick houses had in their dusty windows the sightless, moribund look of incurable decay, empty shells awaiting demolition. From the other side, life had not departed wholly as yet. Facing the only gas lamp yawned the cavern of a second-hand furniture dealer, where, deep in the gloom of a sort of narrow avenue winding through a bizarre forest of wardrobes, with an undergrowth tangle of table legs, a tall pier glass glimmered like a pool of water in a wood. An unhappy, homeless couch, accompanied by two unrelated chairs, stood in the open. The only human being making use of the alley besides the professor, coming stalwart and erect from the opposite direction, checked his swinging pace suddenly. "Hello," he said, and stood a little on one side watchfully. The professor had already stopped, with a ready half-turn which brought his shoulders very near the other wall. His right hand fell lightly on the back of the outcast couch, the left remained purposefully plunged deep in the trousers pocket, and the roundness of the heavy-rimmed spectacles imparted an owlish character to his moody, unperturbed face. It was like a meeting in a side corridor of a mansion full of life. The stalwart man was buttoned up in a dark overcoat and carried an umbrella. His hat, tilted back, uncovered a good deal of forehead, which appeared very white in the dusk. In the dark patches of the orbits the eyeballs glimmered piercingly. Long, drooping moustaches, the colour of ripe corn, framed with their points the square block of his shaved chin. "I'm not looking for you," he said curtly. The professor did not stir an inch. The blended noises of the enormous town sank down to an inarticulate low murmur. Chief Inspector Heat of the Special Crimes Department changed his tone. "Not in a hurry to get home?" he asked with mocking simplicity. The unwholesome-looking little moral agent of destruction exulted silently in the possession of personal prestige, keeping in check this man armed with the defensive mandate of a menaced society. More fortunate than Caligula, who wished that the Roman Senate had only one head for the better satisfaction of his cruel lust, he beheld in that one man all the forces he had set at defiance, the force of law, property, oppression, and injustice. He beheld all his enemies and fearlessly confronted them all in the supreme satisfaction of his vanity. They stood perplexed before him as before a dreadful portent. He gloated inwardly over the chance of this meeting affirming his superiority over all the multitude of mankind. It was in reality a chance meeting. Chief Inspector Heat had had a disagreeably busy day since his department received the first telegram from Greenwich a little before 11 in the morning. First of all, the fact of the outrage being attempted less than a week after he had assured a high official that no outbreak of anarchist activity was to be apprehended was sufficiently annoying. If he ever thought himself safe in making a statement, it was then. He had made that statement with infinite satisfaction to himself, because it was clear that the high official desired greatly to hear that very thing. He had affirmed that nothing of the sort could even be thought of without the department being aware of it within 24 hours. And he had spoken thus in his consciousness of being the great expert of his department. He had gone even so far as to utter words which true wisdom would have kept back. But Chief Inspector Heat was not very wise, at least not truly so. True wisdom, which is not certain of anything in this world of contradictions, would have prevented him from attaining his present position. It would have alarmed his superiors and done away with his chances of promotion. His promotion had been very rapid. "There isn't one of them, sir, that we couldn't lay our hands on at any time of night and day. We know what each of them is doing hour by hour," he had declared. And the high official had deigned to smile. This was so obviously the right thing to say for an officer of Chief Inspector Heat's reputation that it was perfectly delightful. The high official believed the declaration, which chimed in with his idea of the fitness of things. His wisdom was of an official kind, or else he might have reflected upon a matter not of theory, but of experience, that in the close woven stuff of relations between conspirator and police there occur unexpected solutions of continuity, sudden holes in space and time. A given anarchist may be watched inch by inch and minute by minute, but lost for a few hours during which something, generally an explosion, more or less deplorable does happen. But the high official, carried away by his sense of the fitness of things, had smiled, and now the recollection of that smile was very annoying to Chief Inspector Heat, principal expert in anarchist procedure. This was not the only circumstance whose recollection depressed the usual serenity of the eminent specialist. There was another, dating back only to that very morning. The thought that when called urgently to his assistant commissioner's private room, he had been unable to conceal his astonishment was distinctly vexing. His instinct of a successful man had taught him long ago that, as a general rule, a reputation is built on manner as much as on achievement. And he felt that his manner, when confronted with the telegram, had not been impressive. He had opened his eyes widely and had exclaimed, "Impossible!" exposing himself thereby to the unanswerable retort of a fingertip laid forcibly on the telegram which the Assistant Commissioner, after reading it aloud, had flung on the desk. To be crushed, as it were, under the tip of a forefinger was an unpleasant experience. Very damaging, too. Furthermore, Chief Inspector Heat was conscious of not having mended matters by allowing himself to express a conviction. "One thing I can tell you at once. None of our lot had anything to do with this." He was strong in his integrity of a good detective, but he saw now that an impenetrable, attentive reserve towards this incident would have served his reputation better. On the other hand, he admitted to himself that it was difficult to preserve one's reputation if rank outsiders were going to take a hand in the business. Outsiders are the bane of the police as of other professions. The tone of the Assistant Commissioner's remarks had been sour enough to set one's teeth on edge. And since breakfast, Chief Inspector Heat had not managed to get anything to eat. Starting immediately to begin his investigation on the spot, he had swallowed a good deal of raw, unwholesome fog in the park. Then he had walked over to the hospital, and when the investigation in Greenwich was concluded, at last he had lost his inclination for food. Not accustomed, as the doctors are, to examine closely the mangled remains of human beings, he had been shocked by the sight disclosed to his view when a waterproof sheet had been lifted off a table in a certain apartment of the hospital. Another waterproof sheet was spread over that table in the manner of a tablecloth, with the corners turned up over a sort of mound, a heap of rags, scorched and blood-stained, half concealing what might have been an accumulation of raw material for a cannibal feast. It required considerable firmness of mind not to recoil before that sight. Chief Inspector Heat, an efficient officer of his department, stood his ground, but for a whole minute he did not advance. A local constable in uniform cast a sidelong glance and said, with stolid simplicity, "He's all there. Every bit of him. It was a job." He had been the first man on the spot after the explosion. He mentioned the fact again. He had seen something like a heavy flash of lightning in the fog. At that time he was standing at the door of the King William Street Lodge talking to the keeper. The concussion made him tingle all over. He ran between the trees towards the observatory. "As fast as my legs would carry me," he repeated twice. Chief Inspector Heat, bending forward over the table in a gingerly and horrified manner, let him run on. The hospital porter and another man turned down the corners of the cloth and stepped aside. The Chief Inspector's eyes searched the gruesome detail of that heap of mixed things which seemed to have been collected in shambles and rag shops. "You used a shovel," he remarked, observing a sprinkling of small gravel, tiny brown bits of bark, and particles of splintered wood as fine as needles. "Had to in one place," said the stolid constable. "I sent a keeper to fetch the spade. When he heard me scraping the ground with it, he leaned his forehead against a tree and was sick as a dog." The Chief Inspector, stooping guardedly over the table, fought down the unpleasant sensation in his throat. The shattering violence of destruction which had made of that body a heap of nameless fragments affected his feelings with a sense of ruthless cruelty, though his reason told him the effect must have been as swift as a flash of lightning. The man, whoever he was, had died instantaneously, and yet it seemed impossible to believe that a human body could have reached that state of disintegration without passing through the pangs of inconceivable agony. No physiologist, and still less of a metaphysician, Chief Inspector Heat rose by the force of sympathy, which is a form of fear, above the vulgar conception of time. Instantaneous! He remembered all he had ever read in popular publications of long and terrifying dreams, dreamed in the instant of waking, of the whole past life lived with frightful intensity by a drowning man as his doomed head bobs up, streaming for the last time. The inexplicable mysteries of conscious existence beset Chief Inspector Heat, till he evolved the horrible notion that ages of atrocious pain and mental torture could be contained between two successive winks of an eye. And meantime the Chief Inspector went on, peering at the table with a calm face, and the slightly anxious attention of an indigent customer bending over what may be called the by-products of a butcher's shop, with a view to an inexpensive Sunday dinner. All the time his trained faculties of an excellent investigator, who scorns no chance of information, followed the self-satisfied, disjointed loquacity of the constable. "A fair-haired fellow," the last observed in a placid tone, and paused. The old woman who spoke to the sergeant noticed a fair-haired fellow coming out of Maze Hill Station. He paused. "And he was a fair-haired fellow." "She noticed two men coming out of the station after the up train had gone on," he continued slowly. "She couldn't tell if they were together. She took no particular notice of the big one, but the other was a fair, slight chap, carrying a tin varnish can in one hand." The constable ceased. "Know the woman?" muttered the Chief Inspector, with his eyes fixed on the table and a vague notion in his mind of an inquest to be held presently upon a person likely to remain forever unknown. "Yes, she is housekeeper to a retired publican and attends a chapel in Park Place sometimes," the constable uttered weightily, and paused, with another oblique glance at the table. Then suddenly, "Well, here he is. All of him I could see. Fair, slight enough. Look at that foot there. I picked up the legs first, one after another. It was that scattered you didn't know where to begin." The constable paused. The least flicker of an innocent self-laudatory smile invested his round face with an infantile expression. "Stumbled," he announced positively. "I stumbled once myself, and pitched on my head too, while running up. Them roots do stick out all about the place. Stumbled against the root of a tree and fell, and that thing he was carrying must have gone off right under his chest, I expect." The echo of the words "person unknown" repeating itself in his inner consciousness bothered the Chief Inspector considerably. He would have liked to trace this affair back to its mysterious origin for his own information. He was professionally curious. Before the public he would have liked to vindicate the efficiency of his department by establishing the identity of that man. He was a loyal servant. That, however, appeared impossible. The first term of the problem was unreadable, lacked all suggestion but that of atrocious cruelty. Overcoming his physical repugnance, Chief Inspector Heat stretched out his hands without conviction for the salving of his conscience, and took up the least soiled of the rags. It was a narrow strip of velvet, with a larger triangular piece of dark blue cloth hanging from it. He held it up to his eyes, and the police constable spoke. "Velvet collar. Funny the old woman should have noticed the velvet collar. Dark blue overcoat with a velvet collar, she has told us. He was the chap she saw. No mistake. And here he is all complete, velvet collar and all. I don't think I missed a single piece as big as a postage stamp." At this point the trained faculties of the Chief Inspector ceased to hear the voice of the constable. He moved to one of the windows for better light. His face, averted from the room, expressed a startled, intense interest while he examined closely the triangular piece of broadcloth. By a sudden jerk he detached it, and only after stuffing it into his pocket, turned round to the room and flung the velvet collar back on the table. "Cover up," he directed the attendant curtly, without another look, and saluted by the constable carried off his spoil hastily. A convenient train whirled him up to town, alone and pondering deeply, in a third-class apartment. That singed piece of cloth was incredibly valuable, and he could not defend himself from astonishment at the casual manner it had come into his possession. It was as if fate had thrust that clue into his hands. And after the manner of the average man, whose ambition is to command events, he began to mistrust such a gratuitous and accidental success, just because it seemed forced upon him. The practical value of success depends not a little on the way you look at it. But fate looks at nothing. It has no discretion. He no longer considered it eminently desirable all round to establish publicly the identity of the man who had blown himself up that morning with such horrible completeness. But he was not certain of the view his department would take. A department is to those it employs a complex personality with ideas and even fads of its own. It depends on the loyal devotion of its servants, and the devoted loyalty of trusted servants is associated with a certain amount of affectionate contempt, which keeps it sweet, as it were. By a benevolent provision of nature, no man is a hero to his valet, or else the heroes would have to brush their own clothes. Likewise, no department appears perfectly wise to the intimacy of its workers. A department does not know so much as some of its servants. Being a dispassionate organism, it can never be perfectly informed. It would not be good for its efficiency to know too much. Chief Inspector Heat got out of the train in a state of thoughtfulness entirely untainted with disloyalty, but not quite free of that jealous mistrust which so often springs on the ground of perfect devotion, whether to women or to institutions. It was in this mental disposition, physically very empty, but still nauseated by what he had seen, that he had come upon the Professor. Under these conditions, which make for irascibility in a sound, normal man, this meeting was specially unwelcome to Chief Inspector Heat. He had not been thinking of the Professor. He had not been thinking of any individual anarchist at all. The complexion of that case had somehow forced upon him the general idea of the absurdity of things human, which in the abstract is sufficiently annoying to an unphilosophical temperament, and in concrete instances becomes exasperating beyond endurance. At the beginning of his career, Chief Inspector Heat had been concerned with the more energetic forms of thieving. He had gained his spurs in that sphere, and naturally enough had kept for it, after his promotion to another department, a feeling not very far removed from affection. Thieving was not a sheer absurdity. It was a form of human industry, perverse indeed, but still an industry exercised in an industrious world. It was work undertaken for the same reason as the work in potteries, coal mines, in fields, in tool-grinding shops. It was labour, whose practical difference from the other forms of labour consisted in the nature of its risk, which did not lie in ankylosing or lead poisoning or fire damp or gritty dust, but in what may be briefly defined in its own special phraseology as 7 years hard. Chief Inspector Heat was, of course, not insensible to the gravity of moral differences, but neither were the thieves he had been looking after. They submitted to the severe sanctions of a morality familiar to Chief Inspector Heat with a certain resignation. They were his fellow citizens gone wrong because of imperfect education, Chief Inspector Heat believed. But allowing for that difference, he could understand the mind of a burglar because, as a matter of fact, the mind and the instincts of a burglar are of the same kind as the mind and the instincts of a police officer. Both recognize the same conventions and have a working knowledge of each other's methods and of the routine of their respective trades. They understand each other, which is advantageous to both, and establishes a sort of amenity in their relations. Products of the same machine, one classed as useful and the other as noxious, they take the machine for granted in different ways, but with a seriousness essentially the same. The mind of Chief Inspector Heat was inaccessible to ideas of revolt. But his thieves were not rebels. His bodily vigour, his cool, inflexible manner, his courage and his fairness had secured for him much respect and some adulation in the sphere of his early successes. He had felt himself revered and admired. And Chief Inspector Heat, arrested within 6 paces of the anarchist nicknamed the Professor, gave a thought of regret to the world of thieves, sane, without morbid ideals, working by routine, respectful of constituted authorities, free from all taint of hate and despair. After paying his tribute to what is normal in the constitution of society, for the idea of thieving appeared to his instinct as normal as the idea of property, Chief Inspector Heat felt very angry with himself for having stopped, for having spoken, for having taken that way at all, on the ground of it being a shortcut from the station to the headquarters. And he spoke again in his big authoritative voice, which, being moderated, had a threatening character. "You are not wanted, I tell you," he repeated. The anarchist did not stir. An inward laugh of derision uncovered not only his teeth, but his gums as well, shook him all over without the slightest sound. Chief Inspector Heat was led to add, against his better judgment, "Not yet. When I want you, I will know where to find you." Those were perfectly proper words, within the tradition and suitable to his character of a police officer addressing one of his special flock. But the reception they got departed from tradition and propriety. It was outrageous. The stunted, weakly figure before him spoke at last. "I've no doubt the papers would give you an obituary notice then. You know best what that would be worth to you. I should think you can imagine easily the sort of stuff that would be printed. But you may be exposed to the unpleasantness of being buried together with me, though I suppose your friends would make an effort to sort us out as much as possible." With all his healthy contempt for the spirit dictating such speeches, the atrocious elusiveness of the words had its effect on the Chief Inspector Heat. He had too much insight and too much exact information as well to dismiss them as rot. The dusk of this narrow lane took on a sinister tint from the dark, frail little figure, its back to the wall, and speaking with a weak, self-confident voice. To the vigorous, tenacious vitality of the Chief Inspector, the physical wretchedness of that being, so obviously not fit to live, was ominous, for it seemed to him that if he had the misfortune to be such a miserable object, he would not have cared how soon he died. Life had such a strong hold upon him that a fresh wave of nausea broke out in slight perspiration upon his brow. The murmur of town life, the subdued rumble of wheels in the 2 invisible streets to the right and left, came through the curve of the sordid lane to his ears with a precious familiarity and an appealing sweetness. He was human. But Chief Inspector Heat was also a man, and he could not let such words pass. "All this is good to frighten children with," he said. "I'll have you yet." It was very well said, without scorn, with an almost austere quietness. "Doubtless," was the answer. "But there's no time like the present, believe me. For a man of real convictions, this is a fine opportunity of self-sacrifice. You may not find another so favourable, so humane. There isn't even a cat near us, and these condemned old houses would make a good heap of bricks where you stand. You'll never get me at so little cost to life and property, which you are paid to protect." "You don't know who you're speaking to," said Chief Inspector Heat firmly. "If I were to lay my hands on you now, I would be no better than yourself." "Ah, the game. You may be sure our side will win in the end. It may yet be necessary to make people believe that some of you ought to be shot at sight, like mad dogs. Then that will be the game. But I'll be damned if I know what yours is. I don't believe you know yourselves. You'll never get anything by it. Meantime, it's you who get something from it, so far. And you get it easily, too. I won't speak of your salary, but haven't you made your name simply by not understanding what we're after? What are you after, then? Asked Chief Inspector Heat, with scornful haste, like a man in a hurry who perceives he is wasting his time. The perfect anarchist answered by a smile which did not part his thin, colourless lips, and the celebrated Chief Inspector felt a sense of superiority which induced him to raise a warning finger. "Give it up, whatever it is," he said in an admonishing tone, but not so kindly as if he were condescending to give good advice to a cracksman of repute. "Give it up. You'll find we are too many for you." The fixed smile on the professor's lips wavered, as if the mocking spirit within had lost its assurance. Chief Inspector Heat went on. "Don't you believe me, eh? Well, you've only got to look about you. We are. And anyway, you're not doing it well. You're always making a mess of it. Why, if the thieves didn't know their work better, they would starve." The hint of an invisible multitude behind that man's back roused a sombre indignation in the breast of the professor. He smiled no longer his enigmatic and mocking smile. The resisting power of numbers, the unattackable stolidity of a great multitude, was the haunting fear of a sinister loneliness. His lips trembled for some time before he managed to say in a strangled voice, "I am doing my work better than you are doing yours." "That'll do now," interrupted Chief Inspector Heat hurriedly, and the professor laughed right out this time. While still laughing he moved on, but he did not laugh long. It was a sad-faced, miserable little man who emerged from the narrow passage into the bustle of the broad thoroughfare. He walked with the nerveless gait of a tramp going on, still going on, indifferent to rain or sun in a sinister detachment from the aspects of sky and earth. Chief Inspector Heat, on the other hand, after watching him for a while, stepped out with the purposeful briskness of a man disregarding indeed the inclemencies of the weather, but conscious of having an authorized mission on this earth and the moral support of his kind. All the inhabitants of the immense town, the population of the whole country, and even the teeming millions struggling upon the planet, were with him, down to the very thieves and mendicants. Yes, the thieves themselves were sure to be with him in his present work. The consciousness of universal support in his general activity heartened him to grapple with a particular problem. The problem immediately before the Chief Inspector was that of managing the Assistant Commissioner of his department, his immediate superior. This is the perennial problem of trusty and loyal servants. Anarchism gave it its particular complexion, but nothing more. Truth to say, Chief Inspector Heat thought but little of anarchism. He did not attach undue importance to it, and could never bring himself to consider it seriously. It had more the character of disorderly conduct. Disorderly without the human excuse of drunkenness, which at any rate implies good feeling and an amiable leaning towards festivity. As criminals, anarchists were distinctly no class at all. And recalling the professor, Chief Inspector Heat, without checking his swinging pace, muttered through his teeth, "Lunatic." Catching thieves was another matter altogether. It had that quality of seriousness belonging to every form of open sport, where the best man wins under perfectly comprehensible rules. There were no rules for dealing with anarchists, and that was distasteful to the Chief Inspector. It was all foolishness, but that foolishness excited the public mind, affected persons in high places, and touched upon international relations. A hard, merciless contempt settled rigidly on the Chief Inspector's face as he walked on. His mind ran over all the anarchists of his flock. Not one of them had half the spunk of this or that burglar he had known. Not half, not 1/10. At headquarters, the Chief Inspector was admitted at once to the Assistant Commissioner's private room. He found him, pen in hand, bent over a great table bestrewn with papers, as if worshipping an enormous double inkstand of bronze and crystal. Speaking tubes resembling snakes were tied by the heads to the back of the Assistant Commissioner's wooden armchair, and their gaping mouths seemed ready to bite his elbows. And in this attitude he raised only his eyes, whose lids were darker than his face, and very much creased. The reports had come in. Every anarchist had been exactly accounted for. After saying this, he lowered his eyes, signed rapidly 2 single sheets of paper, and only then laid down his pen, and sat well back, directing an inquiring gaze at his renowned subordinate. The Chief Inspector stood it well, deferential but inscrutable. "I dare say you were right," said the Assistant Commissioner, "in telling me at first that the London anarchists had nothing to do with this. I quite appreciate the excellent watch kept on them by your men. On the other hand, this, for the public, does not amount to more than a confession of ignorance." The Assistant Commissioner's delivery was leisurely, as it were cautious. His thoughts seemed to rest poised on a word before passing to another, as though words had been the stepping stones for his intellect picking its way across the waters of error. "Unless you have brought something useful from Greenwich," he added. The Chief Inspector began at once the account of his investigation in a clear, matter-of-fact manner. His superior, turning his chair a little, and crossing his thin legs, leaned sideways on his elbow, with one hand shading his eyes. His listening attitude had a sort of angular and sorrowful grace. Gleams as of highly burnished silver played on the sides of his ebony black head when he inclined it slowly at the end. Chief Inspector Heat waited with the appearance of turning over in his mind all he had just said, but, as a matter of fact, considering the advisability of saying something more. The Assistant Commissioner cut his hesitation short. "You believe there were 2 men?" he asked, without uncovering his eyes. The Chief Inspector thought it more than probable. In his opinion, the 2 men had parted from each other within 100 yards from the observatory walls. He explained also how the other man could have got out of the park speedily without being observed. The fog, though not very dense, was in his favour. He seemed to have escorted the other to the spot, and then to have left him there to do the job single-handed. Taking the time those 2 were seen coming out of Maze Hill Station by the old woman, and the time when the explosion was heard, the Chief Inspector thought that the other man might have been actually at the Greenwich Park Station, ready to catch the next train up, at the moment his comrade was destroying himself so thoroughly. "Very thoroughly, eh?" murmured the Assistant Commissioner from under the shadow of his hand. The Chief Inspector, in a few vigorous words, described the aspect of the remains. "The coroner's jury will have a treat," he added grimly. The Assistant Commissioner uncovered his eyes. "We shall have nothing to tell them," he remarked languidly. He looked up, and for a time watched the markedly non-committal attitude of his Chief Inspector. His nature was one that is not easily accessible to illusions. He knew that a department is at the mercy of its subordinate officers, who have their own conceptions of loyalty. His career had begun in a tropical colony. He had liked his work there. It was police work. He had been very successful in tracking and breaking up certain nefarious secret societies amongst the natives. Then he took his long leave and got married rather impulsively. It was a good match from a worldly point of view, but his wife formed an unfavourable opinion of the colonial climate on hearsay evidence. On the other hand, she had influential connections. It was an excellent match. But he did not like the work he had to do now. He felt himself dependent on too many subordinates and too many masters. The near presence of that strange emotional phenomenon called public opinion weighed upon his spirits and alarmed him by its irrational nature. No doubt that from ignorance he exaggerated to himself its power for good and evil, especially for evil. And the rough east winds of the English spring, which agreed with his wife, augmented his general mistrust of men's motives and of the efficiency of their organization. The futility of office work especially appalled him on those days so trying to his sensitive liver. He got up, unfolding himself to his full height, and with a heaviness of step remarkable in so slender a man, moved across the room to the window. The panes streamed with rain, and the short street he looked down into lay wet and empty, as if swept clear suddenly by a great flood. It was a very trying day, choked in raw fog to begin with, and now drowned in cold rain. The flickering, blurred flames of gas lamps seemed to be dissolving in a watery atmosphere, and the lofty pretensions of a mankind oppressed by the miserable indignities of the weather appeared as a colossal and hopeless vanity, deserving of scorn, wonder, and compassion. Horrible, horrible, thought the Assistant Commissioner to himself, with his face near the window pane. We have been having this sort of thing now for 10 days. No, a fortnight. He ceased to think completely for a time. That utter stillness of his brain lasted about 3 seconds. Then he said perfunctorily, "You have set inquiries on foot for tracing that other man up and down the line?" He had no doubt that everything needful had been done. Chief Inspector Heat knew, of course, thoroughly the business of man-hunting, and these were the routine steps too, that would be taken as a matter of course by the merest beginner. A few inquiries amongst the ticket collectors and the porters of the 2 small railway stations would give additional details as to the appearance of the 2 men. The inspection of the collected tickets would show at once where they came from that morning. It was elementary and could not have been neglected. Accordingly, the Chief Inspector answered that all this had been done directly the old woman had come forward with her deposition. And he mentioned the name of a station. "That's where they came from, sir," he went on. "The porter who took the tickets at Maze Hill remembers 2 chaps answering to the description passing the barrier. They seemed to him 2 respectable working men of a superior sort, sign painters or house decorators. The big man got out of a 3rd-class compartment backward, with a bright tin can in his hand. On the platform he gave it to carry to the fair young fellow who followed him. All this agrees exactly with what the old woman told the police sergeant in Greenwich." The Assistant Commissioner, still with his face turned to the window, expressed his doubts as to these 2 men having had anything to do with the outrage. All this theory rested upon the utterances of an old charwoman who had been nearly knocked down by a man in a hurry. Not a very substantial authority indeed, unless on the ground of sudden inspiration which was hardly tenable. "Frankly now, could she have been really inspired?" he queried, with grave irony, keeping his back to the room, as if entranced by the contemplation of the town's colossal forms half lost in the night. He did not even look round when he heard the mutter of the word "providential" from the principal subordinate of his department, whose name, printed sometimes in the papers, was familiar to the great public as that of one of its zealous and hard-working protectors. Chief Inspector Heat raised his voice a little. "Strips and bits of bright tin were quite visible to me," he said. "That's a pretty good corroboration. And these men came from that little country station," the Assistant Commissioner mused aloud, wondering. He was told that such was the name on 2 tickets out of 3 given up out of that train at Maze Hill. The third person who got out was a hawker from Gravesend, well known to the porters. The Chief Inspector imparted that information in a tone of finality with some ill humour, as loyal servants will do in the consciousness of their fidelity and with the sense of the value of their loyal exertions. And still, the Assistant Commissioner did not turn away from the darkness outside, as vast as a sea. "2 foreign anarchists coming from that place," he said, apparently to the windowpane. "It's rather unaccountable." "Yes, sir. But it would be still more unaccountable if that Michaelis weren't staying in a cottage in the neighbourhood." At the sound of that name, falling unexpectedly into this annoying affair, the Assistant Commissioner dismissed brusquely the vague remembrance of his daily whist party at his club. It was the most comforting habit of his life, in a mainly successful display of his skill, without the assistance of any subordinate. He entered his club to play from 5 to 7 before going home to dinner, forgetting for those 2 hours whatever was distasteful in his life, as though the game were a beneficent drug for allaying the pangs of moral discontent. His partners were the gloomily humorous editor of a celebrated magazine, a silent elderly barrister with malicious little eyes, and a highly martial, simple-minded old colonel with nervous brown hands. They were his club acquaintances merely. He never met them elsewhere except at the card table. But they all seemed to approach the game in the spirit of co-sufferers, as if it were indeed a drug against the secret ills of existence. And every day as the sun declined over the countless roofs of the town, a mellow, pleasurable impatience, resembling the impulse of a sure and profound friendship, lightened his professional labours. And now this pleasurable sensation went out of him with something resembling a physical shock, and was replaced by a special kind of interest in his work of social protection, an improper sort of interest, which may be defined best as a sudden and alert mistrust of the weapon in his hand. End of chapter 5.
This is a LibriVox recording. For more information, please visit LibriVox.blogsome.com. The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, Chapter 6. The lady patroness of Michaelis, the ticket of leave apostle of humanitarian hopes, was one of the most influential and distinguished connections of the Assistant Commissioner's wife, whom she called Annie, and treated still rather as a not very wise and utterly inexperienced young girl. But she had consented to accept him on a friendly footing, which was by no means the case with all of his wife's influential connections. Married young and splendidly at some remote epoch of the past, she had had for a time a close view of great affairs, and even of some great men. She herself was a great lady. Old now in the number of her years, she had that sort of exceptional temperament which defies time with scornful disregard, as if it were a rather vulgar convention submitted to by the mass of inferior mankind. Many other conventions easier to set aside, alas, failed to obtain her recognition, also on temperamental grounds, either because they bored her, or else because they stood in the way of her scorns and sympathies. Admiration was a sentiment unknown to her. It was one of the secret griefs of her most noble husband against her. First, as always more or less tainted with mediocrity, and next as being in a way an admission of inferiority. And both were frankly inconceivable to her nature. To be fearlessly outspoken in her opinions came easily to her, since she judged solely from the standpoint of her social position. She was equally untrammeled in her actions, and as her tactfulness proceeded from genuine humanity, her bodily vigor remained remarkable, and her superiority was serene and cordial. 3 generations had admired her infinitely, and the last she was likely to see had pronounced her a wonderful woman. Meantime intelligent, with a sort of lofty simplicity, and curious at heart, but not like many women merely of social gossip, she amused her age by attracting within her ken, through the power of her great, almost historical social prestige, everything that rose above the dead level of mankind, lawfully or unlawfully, by position, wit, audacity, fortune, or misfortune. Royal Highnesses, artists, men of science, young statesmen, and charlatans of all ages and conditions who, unsubstantial and light, bobbing up like corks, show best the direction of the surface currents, had been welcomed into that house, listened to, penetrated, understood, appraised for her own edification. In her own words, she liked to watch what the world was coming to. And as she had a practical mind, her judgment of men and things, though based on special prejudices, was seldom totally wrong, and almost never wrong-headed. Her drawing-room was probably the only place in the wide world where an assistant commissioner of police could meet a convict liberated on a ticket of leave on other than professional and official ground. Who had brought Michaelis there one afternoon, the assistant commissioner did not remember very well. He had a notion it must have been a certain member of Parliament of illustrious parentage and unconventional sympathies, which were the standing joke of the comic papers. The notabilities, and even the simple notorieties of the day, brought each other freely to that temple of an old woman's not noble curiosity. You never could guess whom you were likely to come upon being received in semi-privacy within the faded blue silk and gilt-framed screen, making a cozy nook for a couch and a few armchairs in the great drawing-room, with its hum of voices and the groups of people seated or standing in the light of 6 tall windows. Michaelis had been the object of a revulsion of popular sentiment, the same sentiment which years ago had applauded the ferocity of the life sentence passed upon him for complicity in a rather mad attempt to rescue some prisoners from a police van. The plan of the conspirators had been to shoot down the horses and overpower the escort. Unfortunately, one of the police constables got shot too. He left a wife and 3 small children, and the death of that man, aroused through the length and breadth of a realm for whose defense, welfare, and glory men die every day as a matter of duty, an outburst of furious indignation, of a raging, implacable pity for the victim. 3 ringleaders got hanged. Michaelis, young and slim, locksmith by trade, and great frequenter of evening schools, did not even know that anybody had been killed, his part, with a few others, being to force open the door at the back of the special conveyance. When arrested, he had a bunch of skeleton keys in one pocket, a heavy chisel in another, and a short crowbar in his hand, neither more nor less than a burglar. But no burglar would have received such a heavy sentence. The death of the constable had made him miserable at heart, but the failure of the plot also. He did not conceal either of these sentiments from his empaneled countrymen, and that sort of compunction appeared shockingly imperfect to the crammed court. The judge, on passing sentence, commented feelingly upon the depravity and callousness of the young prisoner. That made the groundless fame of his condemnation. The fame of his release was made for him on no better grounds by people who wished to exploit the sentimental aspect of his imprisonment, either for purposes of their own or for no intelligible purpose. He let them do so in the innocence of his heart. and the simplicity of his mind. Nothing that happened to him individually had any importance. He was like those saintly men whose personality is lost in the contemplation of their faith. His ideas were not in the nature of convictions. They were inaccessible to reasoning. They formed in all their contradictions and obscurities an invincible and humanitarian creed, which he confessed rather than preached, with an obstinate gentleness, a smile of pacific assurance on his lips, and his candid blue eyes cast down, because the sight of faces troubled his inspiration developed in solitude. In that characteristic attitude, pathetic in his grotesque and incurable obesity, which he had to drag like a galley slave's bullet to the end of his days, the Assistant Commissioner of Police beheld the ticket of leave apostle filling a privileged armchair within the screen. He sat there by the head of the old lady's couch, mild-voiced and quiet, with no more self-consciousness than a very small child, and with something of a child's charm, the appealing charm of trustfulness. Confident of the future, whose secret ways had been revealed to him within the four walls of a well-known penitentiary, he had no reason to look with suspicion upon anybody. If he could not give the great and curious lady a very definite idea as to what the world was coming to, he had managed without effort to impress her by his unembittered faith, by the sterling quality of his optimism. A certain simplicity of thought is common to serene souls at both ends of the social scale. The great lady was simple in her own way. His views and beliefs had nothing in them to shock or startle her, since she judged them from the standpoint of her lofty position. Indeed, her sympathies were easily accessible to a man of that sort. She was not an exploiting capitalist herself. She was, as it were, above the play of economic conditions, and she had a great capacity of pity for the more obvious forms of common human miseries, precisely because she was such a complete stranger to them that she had to translate her conception into terms of mental suffering before she could grasp the notion of their cruelty. The Assistant Commissioner remembered very well the conversation between these two. He had listened in silence. It was something as exciting in a way, and even touching in its foredoomed futility, as the efforts at moral intercourse between the inhabitants of remote planets. But this grotesque incarnation of humanitarian passion appealed somehow to one's imagination. At last Michaelis rose, and, taking the great lady's extended hand, shook it, retained it for a moment in his great cushioned palm with unembarrassed friendliness, and turned upon the semi-private nook of the drawing-room, his back vast and square, and as if distended under the short tweed jacket. Glancing about in serene benevolence, he waddled along to the distant door between the knots of other visitors. The murmur of conversations paused on his passage. He smiled innocently at a tall, brilliant girl whose eyes met his accidentally, and went out unconscious of the glances following him across the room. Michaelis's first appearance in the world was a success of esteem unmarred by a single murmur of derision. The interrupted conversations were resumed in their proper tone, grave or light. Only a well-set-up, long-limbed, active-looking man of 40 talking with two ladies near a window remarked aloud, with an unexpected depth of feeling, 18 stone, I should say, and not 5'6". Poor fellow, it's terrible, terrible. The lady of the house, gazing absently at the Assistant Commissioner, left alone with her on the private side of the screen, seemed to be rearranging her mental impressions behind her thoughtful immobility of a handsome old face. Men with grey mustaches and full, healthy, vaguely smiling countenances approached, circling round the screen. Two mature women with a matronly air of gracious resolution, a clean-shaved individual with sunken cheeks and dangling a gold-mounted eyeglass on a broad black ribbon with an old-world dandified effect. A silence deferential, but full of reserves, reigned for a moment, and then the great lady exclaimed, not with resentment, but with a sort of protesting indignation, "And that officially is supposed to be a revolutionist? What nonsense!" She looked hard at the Assistant Commissioner, who murmured apologetically, not a dangerous one, perhaps. "Not dangerous? I should think not indeed. He is a mere believer. It's the temperament of a saint, declared the great lady in a firm tone. And they kept him shut up for 20 years. One shudders at the stupidity of it. And now they have let him out. Everybody belonging to him has gone away somewhere or dead. His parents are dead. The girl he was to marry has died while he was in prison. He has lost the skill necessary for his manual occupation. He told me all this himself with the sweetest patience. But then he said he had had plenty of time to think things out for himself. A pretty compensation. If that's the stuff revolutionists are made of, some of us may well go on their knees to them, she continued in a slightly bantering voice, while the banal society smiles hardened on their worldly faces, turned towards her with conventional deference. The poor creature is obviously no longer in a position to take care of himself. Somebody will have to look after him a little. He should be recommended to follow a treatment of some sort, the soldierly voice of the active-looking man was heard advising earnestly from a distance. He was in the pink of condition for his age, and even the texture of his long frock coat had a character of elastic soundness, as if it were a living tissue. The man is virtually a cripple, he added with unmistakable feeling. Other voices, as if glad of the opening, murmured hasty compassion. Quite startling, monstrous, most painful to see. The lank man, with the eyeglass on a broad ribbon, pronounced mincingly the word grotesque, whose justness was appreciated by those standing near him. They smiled at each other. The assistant commissioner had expressed no opinion either then or later, his position making it impossible for him to ventilate any independent view of a ticket of leave convict. But, in truth, he shared the view of his wife's friend and patron that Michaelis was a humanitarian sentimentalist, a little mad, but upon the whole incapable of hurting a fly intentionally. So when that name cropped up suddenly in this vexing bomb affair, he realized all the danger of it for the ticket of leave apostle, and his mind reverted at once to the old lady's well-established infatuation. Her arbitrary kindness would not brook patiently any interference with Michaelis's freedom. It was a deep, calm, convinced infatuation. She had not only felt him to be inoffensive, but she had said so, which last, by a confusion of her absolutist mind, became a sort of incontrovertible demonstration. It was as if the monstrosity of the man, with his candid infant's eyes and a fat angelic smile, had fascinated her. She had come to believe almost his theory of the future, since it was not repugnant to her prejudices. She disliked the new element of plutocracy in the social compound, and industrialism as a method of human development appeared to her singularly repulsive in its mechanical and unfeeling character. The humanitarian hopes of the mild Michaelis tended not towards utter destruction, but merely towards the complete economic ruin of the system, and she did not really see where was the moral harm of it. It would do away with all the multitude of the parvenus whom she disliked and mistrusted, not because they had arrived anywhere, she denied that, but because of their profound unintelligence of the world, which was the primary cause of the crudity of their perceptions and the aridity of their hearts. With the annihilation of all capital, they would vanish too. But universal ruin, providing it was universal, as it was revealed to Michaelis, would leave the social values untouched. The disappearance of the last piece of money could not affect people of position. She could not conceive how it could affect her position, for instance. She had developed these discoveries to the assistant commissioner with all the serene fearlessness of an old woman who had escaped the blight of indifference. He had made for himself the rule to receive everything of that sort in a silence which he took care from policy and inclination not to make offensive. He had an affection for the aged disciple of Michaelis, a complex sentiment depending a little on her prestige, on her personality, but most of all on the instinct of flattered gratitude. He felt himself really liked in her house. She was kindness personified. And she was practically wise, too, after the manner of experienced women. She made his married life much easier than it would have been without her generously full recognition of his rights as Annie's husband. Her influence upon his wife, a woman devoured by all sorts of small selfishnesses, small envies, small jealousies, was excellent. Unfortunately, both her kindness and her wisdom were of unreasonable complexion, distinctly feminine and difficult to deal with. She remained a perfect woman all along her full tale of years, and not, as some of them do become, a sort of slippery, pestilential old man in petticoats. And it was as of a woman that he thought of her, the specially choice incarnation of the feminine, wherein is recruited the tender, ingenuous, and fierce bodyguard for all sorts of men who talk under the influence of an emotion, true or fraudulent, for preachers, seers, prophets, or reformers. Appreciating the distinguished and good friend of his wife, and himself in that way, the assistant commissioner became alarmed at the convict Michaelis' possible fate. Once arrested on suspicion of being in some way, however remote, a party to this outrage, the man could hardly escape being sent back to finish his sentence at least, and that would kill him. He would never come out alive. The assistant commissioner made a reflection extremely unbecoming his official position, without being really creditable to his humanity. If the fellow is laid hold of again, he thought, she will never forgive me. The frankness of such a secretly outspoken thought could not go without some derisive self-criticism. No man engaged in a work he does not like can preserve many saving illusions about himself. The distaste, the absence of glamour, extend from the occupation to the personality. It is only when our appointed activities seem by a lucky accident to obey the particular earnestness of our temperament that we can taste the comfort of complete self-deception. The assistant commissioner did not like his work at home. The police work he had been engaged on in a distant part of the globe had the saving character of an irregular sort of warfare, or at least the risk and excitement of open-air sport. His real abilities, which were mainly of an administrative order, were combined with an adventurous disposition. Chained to a desk in the thick of 4 millions of men, he considered himself the victim of an ironic fate, the same, no doubt, which had brought about his marriage with a woman exceptionally sensitive in the matter of colonial climate, besides other limitations testifying to the delicacy of her nature and her tastes. Though he judged his alarm sardonically, he did not dismiss the improper thought from his mind. The instinct of self-preservation was strong within him. On the contrary, he repeated it mentally with profane emphasis and a fuller precision. Damn it! If that infernal Heat has his way, the fellow will die in prison smothered in his fat, and she'll never forgive me. His black narrow figure, with the white band of the collar under the silvery gleams on the close-cropped hair at the back of the head, remained motionless. The silence had lasted such a long time that Chief Inspector Heat ventured to clear his throat. This noise produced its effect. The zealous and intelligent officer was asked by his superior, whose back remained turned to him immovably, "You connect Michaelis with this affair?" Chief Inspector Heat was very positive, but cautious. "Well, sir," he said, "we have enough to go upon. A man like that has no business to be at large anyhow." "You will want some conclusive evidence," came the observation in a murmur. Chief Inspector Heat raised his eyebrows at the black, narrow back, which remained obstinately presented to his intelligence and his zeal. "There will be no difficulty in getting up sufficient evidence against him," he said with virtuous complacency. "You may trust me for that, sir," he added, quite unnecessarily, out of the fullness of his heart. For it seemed to him an excellent thing to have that man in hand to be thrown down to the public, should it think fit to roar with any special indignation in this case. It was impossible to say yet whether it would roar or not. That in the last instance depended, of course, on the newspaper press. But in any case, Chief Inspector Heat, purveyor of prisons by trade, and a man of legal instincts, did logically believe that incarceration was the proper fate for every declared enemy of the law. In the strength of that conviction, he committed a fault of tact. He allowed himself a little conceited laugh and repeated, "Trust me for that, sir." This was too much for the forced calmness under which the assistant commissioner had for upwards of 18 months concealed his irritation with the system and the subordinates of his office. A square peg forced into a round hole, he had felt like a daily outrage that had long established smooth roundness into which a man of less sharply angular shape would have fitted himself with voluptuous acquiescence after a shrug or two. What he resented most was just the necessity of taking so much on trust. At the little laugh of Chief Inspector Heat's, he spun swiftly on his heels, as if whirled away from the window pane by an electric shock. He caught on the latter's face not only the complacency proper to the occasion lurking under the mustache, but the vestiges of experimental watchfulness in the round eyes, which had been, no doubt, fastened on his back, and now met his glance for a second, before the intent character of the stare had the time to change to a merely startled appearance. The Assistant Commissioner of Police had really some qualifications for his post. Suddenly, his suspicion was awakened. It is but fair to say that his suspicions of the police methods, unless the police happened to be a semi-military body organized by himself, was not difficult to arouse. If it ever slumbered from sheer weariness, it was but lightly. And his appreciation of Chief Inspector Heat's zeal and ability, moderate in itself, excluded all notion of moral confidence. "He's up to something," he exclaimed mentally, and at once became angry. Crossing over to his desk, with headlong strides he sat down violently. "Here I am, stuck in a litter of paper," he reflected, with unreasonable resentment, "supposed to hold all the threads in my hands, and yet I can but hold what is put in my hand and nothing else, and they can fasten the other ends of the threads where they please." He raised his head and turned towards his subordinate a long, meagre face, with the accentuated figures of an energetic Don Quixote. "Now what is it you've got up your sleeve?" The other stared. He stared without winking, in a perfect immobility of his round eyes, as he was used to stare at the various members of the criminal class when, after being duly cautioned, they made their statements in the tones of injured innocence, or false simplicity, or sullen resignation. But behind that professional and stony fixity there was some surprise, too, for in such a tone, combining nicely the note of contempt and impatience, Chief Inspector Heat, the right-hand man of the department, was not used to be addressed. He began in a procrastinating manner, like a man taken unawares by a new and unexpected experience. "What I've got against that man Michaelis, you mean, sir?" The Assistant Commissioner watched the bullet head, the points of that Norse rover's mustache falling below the line of the heavy jaw, the whole full and pale physiognomy, whose determined character was marred by too much flesh, at the cunning wrinkles radiating from the outer corners of the eyes, and in that purposeful contemplation of the valuable and trusted officer he drew a conviction so sudden that it moved him like an inspiration. "I have reason to think that when you came into this room," he said in measured tones, "it was not Michaelis who was in your mind, not principally, perhaps not at all." "You have reason to think, sir?" muttered Chief Inspector Heat, with every appearance of astonishment, which up to a certain point was genuine enough. He had discovered in this affair a delicate and perplexing side, forcing upon the discoverer a certain amount of insincerity, that sort of insincerity which, under the names of skill, prudence, discretion, turns up at one point or another in most human affairs. He felt at the moment like a tightrope artist might feel if suddenly, in the middle of the performance, the manager of the music hall were to rush out of the proper managerial seclusion and begin to shake the rope. Indignation, the sense of moral insecurity engendered by such a treacherous proceeding, joined to the immediate apprehension of a broken neck, would, in the colloquial phrase, put him in a state. And there would be also some scandalized concern for his art, too, since a man must identify himself with something more tangible than his own personality, and establish his pride somewhere, either in his social position, or in the quality of work he is obliged to do, or simply in the superiority of the idleness he may be fortunate enough to enjoy. "Yes," said the Assistant Commissioner, "I have. I do not mean to say that you have not thought of Michaelis at all, but you are giving the fact you've mentioned a prominence which strikes me as not quite candid, Inspector Heat. If that is really the track of discovery, why haven't you followed it up at once, either personally or by sending one of your men to that village?" "Do you think, sir, I have failed in my duty there?" the Chief Inspector asked, in a tone which he sought to make simply reflective. Forced unexpectedly to concentrate his faculties upon the task of preserving his balance, he had seized upon that point and exposed himself to a rebuke, for the Assistant Commissioner, frowning slightly, observed that this was a very improper remark to make. "But since you've made it," he continued coldly, "I'll tell you that this is not my meaning." He paused, with a straight glance of his sunken eyes, which was a full equivalent of the unspoken termination, "and you know it." The head of the so-called Special Crimes Department, debarred by his position from going out of doors personally in quest of secrets locked up in guilty breasts, had a propensity to exercise his considerable gifts for the detection of incriminating truth upon his own subordinates. That peculiar instinct could hardly be called a weakness. It was natural. He was a born detective. It had unconsciously governed his choice of a career, and if it ever failed him in life, it was perhaps in the one exceptional circumstance of his marriage, which was also natural. It fed, since it could not roam abroad, upon the human material which was brought to it in its official seclusion. We can never cease to be ourselves. His elbow on the desk, his thin legs crossed, and nursing his cheek in the palm of his meager hand, the Assistant Commissioner, in charge of the Special Crimes Branch, was getting hold of the case with growing interest. His Chief Inspector, if not an absolutely worthy foeman of his penetration, was at any rate the most worthy of all within his reach. A mistrust of established reputations was strictly in character with the Assistant Commissioner's ability as detector. His memory evoked a certain old fat and wealthy native chief in the distant colony, whom it was a tradition for the successive colonial governors to trust and make much of as a firm friend and supporter of the order and legality established by white men, whereas, when examined skeptically, he was found out to be principally his own good friend and nobody else's. Not precisely a traitor, but still a man of many dangerous reservations in his fidelity, caused by a due regard for his own advantage, comfort, and safety. A fellow of some innocence in his naive duplicity, but nonetheless dangerous. He took some finding out. He was physically a big man, too, and, allowing for the difference of color, of course, Chief Inspector Heat's appearance recalled him to the memory of his superior. It was not the eyes nor yet the lips exactly. It was bizarre. But does not Alfred Wallace relate in his famous book on the Malay archipelago how, amongst the Aru Islanders, he discovered in an old and naked savage with a sooty skin a peculiar resemblance to a dear friend at home? For the first time since he took up his appointment, the Assistant Commissioner felt as if he were going to do some real work for his salary, and that was a pleasurable sensation. "I'll turn him inside out like an old glove," thought the Assistant Commissioner, with his eyes resting pensively upon Chief Inspector Heat. "No, that was not my thought," he began again. "There is no doubt about you knowing your business, no doubt at all. And that's precisely why I—" He stopped short, and, changing his tone, "What could you bring up against Michaelis of a definite nature? I mean, apart from the fact that the two men under suspicion, you're certain there were two of them, came last from a railway station within 3 miles of the village where Michaelis is living now." "This by itself is enough for us to go upon, sir, with that sort of man," said the Chief Inspector with returning composure. The slight approving movement of the Assistant Commissioner's head went far to pacify the resentful astonishment of the renowned officer, for Chief Inspector Heat was a kind man, an excellent husband, a devoted father, and the public and departmental confidence he enjoyed acting favorably upon an amiable nature disposed him to feel friendly towards the successive Assistant Commissioners he had seen pass through that very room. There had been 3 in his time. The first one, a soldierly, abrupt, red-faced person with white eyebrows and an explosive temper, could be managed with a silken thread. He left on reaching the age limit. The second, a perfect gentleman, knowing his own and everybody else's place to a nicety, on resigning to take up a higher appointment out of England, got decorated for, really, Inspector Heat's services. To work with him had been a pride and a pleasure. The third, a bit of a dark horse from the first, was at the end of 18 months something of a dark horse still to the department. Upon the whole, Chief Inspector Heat believed him to be in the main harmless. Odd-looking, but harmless. He was speaking now, and the Chief Inspector listened with outward deference, which means nothing, being a matter of duty, and inwardly with benevolent toleration. Michaelis reported himself before leaving London for the country? Yes, sir, he did. And what may he be doing there? Continued the Assistant Commissioner, who was perfectly informed on that point. Fitted with painful tightness into an old wooden armchair before a worm-eaten oak table in an upstairs room of a four-roomed cottage with a roof of moss-grown tiles, Michaelis was writing night and day in a shaky, slanting hand that autobiography of a prisoner, which was to be like a book of Revelation in the history of mankind. The conditions of confined space, seclusion, and solitude in a small, four-roomed cottage were favorable to his inspiration. It was like being in prison, except that one was never disturbed for the odious purpose of taking exercise according to the tyrannical regulations of his old home in the penitentiary. He could not tell whether the sun still shone on the earth or not. The perspiration of the literary labor dropped from his brow. A delightful enthusiasm urged him on. It was the liberation of his inner life, the letting out of his soul into the wide world, and the zeal of his guileless vanity, first awakened by the offer of £500 from a publisher, seemed something predestined and holy. It would be, of course, most desirable to be informed exactly, insisted the Assistant Commissioner uncandidly. Chief Inspector Heat, conscious of renewed irritation at this display of scrupulousness, said that the county police had been notified from the first of Michaelis's arrival, and that a full report could be obtained in a few hours. A wire to the superintendent. Thus he spoke, rather slowly, while his mind seemed already to be weighing the consequences. A slight knitting of the brow was the outward sign of this, but he was interrupted by a question. "You've sent that wire already?" "No, sir," he answered, as if surprised. The Assistant Commissioner uncrossed his legs suddenly. The briskness of that movement contrasted with the casual way in which he threw out a suggestion. "Would you think that Michaelis had anything to do with the preparation of that bomb, for instance?" The Chief Inspector assumed a reflective manner. "I wouldn't say so. There's no necessity to say anything at present. He associates with men who are classed as dangerous. He was made a delegate of the Red Committee less than a year after his release on license. A sort of compliment, I suppose." And the Chief Inspector laughed a little angrily, a little scornfully. With a man of that sort, scrupulousness was a misplaced and even an illegal sentiment. The celebrity bestowed upon Michaelis on his release 2 years ago by some emotional journalists in want of special copy had rankled ever since in his breast. It was perfectly legal to arrest that man on the barest suspicion. It was legal and expedient on the face of it. His two former chiefs would have seen the point at once, whereas this one, without saying either yes or no, sat there as if lost in a dream. Moreover, besides being legal and expedient, the arrest of Michaelis solved a little personal difficulty which worried Chief Inspector Heat somewhat. This difficulty had its bearing upon his reputation, upon his comfort, and even upon the efficient performance of his duties. For if Michaelis no doubt knew something about this outrage, the Chief Inspector was fairly certain that he did not know too much. This was just as well. He knew much less, the Chief Inspector was positive, than certain other individuals he had in his mind, but whose arrest seemed to him inexpedient, besides being a more complicated matter, on account of the rules of the game. The rules of the game did not protect so much Michaelis, who was an ex-convict. It would be stupid not to take advantage of legal facilities, and the journalists who had written him up with emotional gush would be ready to write him down with emotional indignation. This prospect, viewed with confidence, had the attraction of a personal triumph for Chief Inspector Heat. And deep down in his blameless bosom of an average married citizen, almost unconscious, but potent nevertheless, the dislike of being compelled by events to meddle with the desperate ferocity of the professor had its say. This dislike had been strengthened by the chance meeting in the lane. The encounter did not leave behind with Chief Inspector Heat that satisfactory sense of superiority the members of the police force get from the unofficial but intimate side of their intercourse with the criminal classes, by which the vanity of power is soothed and the vulgar love of domination over our fellow creatures is flattered as worthily as it deserves. The perfect anarchist was not recognized as a fellow creature by Chief Inspector Heat. He was impossible, a mad dog to be left alone. Not that the Chief Inspector was afraid of him. On the contrary, he meant to have him some day, but not yet. He meant to get hold of him in his own time, properly and effectively according to the rules of the game. The present was not the right time for attempting that feat, not the right time for many reasons, personal and of public service. This being the strong feeling of Inspector Heat, it appeared to him just and proper that this affair should be shunted off its obscure and inconvenient track, leading goodness knows where, into a quiet and lawful siding called Michaelis. And he repeated, as if reconsidering the suggestion conscientiously, "The bomb. No, I would not say that exactly. We may never find that out. But it's clear that he is connected with this in some way, which we can find out without much trouble." His countenance had that look of grave, overbearing indifference, once well known and much dreaded by the better sort of thieves. Chief Inspector Heat, though what is called a man, was not a smiling animal, but his inward state was that of satisfaction at the passively receptive attitude of the Assistant Commissioner, who murmured gently, "And you really think that the investigation should be made in that direction?" "I do, sir." "Quite convinced?" "I am, sir. That's the true line for us to take." The Assistant Commissioner withdrew the support of his hand from his reclining head with a suddenness that, considering his languid attitude, seemed to menace his whole person with collapse. But, on the contrary, he sat up, extremely alert, behind the great writing table on which his hand had fallen with the sound of a sharp blow. "What I want to know is what put it out of your head till now." "Put it out of my head?" repeated the Chief Inspector very slowly. "Yes, till you were called into this room, you know." The Chief Inspector felt as if the air between his clothing and his skin had become unpleasantly hot. It was the sensation of an unprecedented and incredible experience. "Of course," he said, exaggerating the deliberation of his utterance to the utmost limits of possibility. "If there is a reason, of which I know nothing, for not interfering with the convict Michaelis, perhaps it's just as well I didn't start the county police after him." This took such a long time to say that the unflagging attention of the Assistant Commissioner seemed a wonderful feat of endurance. His retort came without delay. "No reason whatever that I know of. Come, Chief Inspector, this finessing with me is highly improper on your part, highly improper. And it's also unfair, you know. You shouldn't leave me to puzzle things out for myself like this. Really, I am surprised." He paused, then added smoothly, "I need scarcely tell you that this conversation is altogether unofficial." These words were far from pacifying the Chief Inspector. The indignation of a betrayed tightrope performer was strong within him. In his pride of a trusted servant, he was affected by the assurance that the rope was not shaken for the purpose of breaking his neck, as by an exhibition of impudence. As if anybody were afraid! Assistant Commissioners come and go, but a valuable Chief Inspector is not an ephemeral office phenomenon. He was not afraid of getting a broken neck. To have his performance spoiled was more than enough to account for the glow of honest indignation. And as thought is no respecter of persons, the thought of Chief Inspector Heat took a threatening and prophetic shape. "You, my boy," he said to himself, keeping his round and habitually roving eyes fastened upon the Assistant Commissioner's face, "you, my boy, don't know your place, and your place won't know you very long either, I bet." As if in provoking answer to that thought, something like the ghost of an amiable smile passed on the lips of the Assistant Commissioner. His manner was easy and businesslike, while he persisted in administering another shake to the tightrope. "Let us come now to what you have discovered on the spot, Chief Inspector," he said. "A fool and his job are soon parted," went on the train of prophetic thought in Chief Inspector Heat's head, but it was immediately followed by the reflection that a higher official, even when fired out, this was the precise image, has still the time as he flies through the door to launch a nasty kick at the shin bones of a subordinate. Without softening very much the basilisk nature of his stare, he said impassively, "We're coming to that part of my investigation, sir." "That's right. Well, what have you brought away from it?" The Chief Inspector, who had made up his mind to jump off the rope, came to the ground with gloomy frankness. "I've brought away an address," he said, pulling out of his pocket without haste a singed rag of dark blue cloth. "This belongs to the overcoat the fellow who got himself blown to pieces was wearing. Of course, the overcoat may not have been his, and may even have been stolen, but that's not at all probable if you look at this." The Chief Inspector, stepping up to the table, smoothed out carefully the rag of blue cloth. He had picked it up from the repulsive heap in the mortuary, because a tailor's name is found sometimes under the collar. It is not often of much use, but still, he only half expected to find anything useful, but certainly he did not expect to find, not under the collar at all, but stitched carefully on the underside of the lapel, a square piece of calico with an address written on it in marking ink. The Chief Inspector removed his smoothing hand. "I carried it off with me without anybody taking notice," he said. "I thought it best. It can always be produced if required." The Assistant Commissioner, rising a little in his chair, pulled the cloth over to his side of the table. He sat looking at it in silence. Only the number 32 and the name of Brett Street were written in marking ink on a piece of calico slightly larger than an ordinary cigarette paper. He was genuinely surprised. "Can't understand why he should have gone about labeled like this," he said, looking up at Chief Inspector Heat. "It's a most extraordinary thing." "I met once in the smoking room of a hotel an old gentleman who went about with his name and address sewn on in all his coats in case of an accident or sudden illness," said the Chief Inspector. "He professed to be 84 years old, but he didn't look his age. He told me he was also afraid of losing his memory suddenly, like those people he has been reading of in the papers." A question from the Assistant Commissioner, who wanted to know what was number 32 Brett Street, interrupted that reminiscence abruptly. The Chief Inspector, driven down to the ground by unfair artifices, had elected to walk the path of unreserved openness. If he firmly believed that to know too much was not good for the department, the judicious holding back of knowledge was as far as his loyalty dared to go for the good of the service. If the Assistant Commissioner wanted to mismanage this affair, nothing, of course, could prevent him. But on his own part, he now saw no reason for a display of alacrity, so he answered concisely, "It's a shop, sir." The Assistant Commissioner, with his eyes lowered on the rag of blue cloth, waited for more information. As that did not come, he proceeded to obtain it by a series of questions propounded with gentle patience. Thus he acquired an idea of the nature of Mr. Verloc's commerce, of his personal appearance, and heard at last his name. In a pause, the Assistant Commissioner raised his eyes and discovered some animation on the Chief Inspector's face. They looked at each other in silence. "Of course," said the latter, "the department has no record of that man." "Did any of my predecessors have any knowledge of what you have told me now?" asked the Assistant Commissioner, putting his elbows on the table and raising his joined hands before his face, as if about to offer prayer, only that his eyes had not a pious expression. "No, sir, certainly not. What would have been the object? That sort of man could never be produced publicly to any good purpose. It was sufficient for me to know who he was, and to make use of him in any way that could be used publicly." "And do you think that sort of private knowledge consistent with the official position you occupy?" "Perfectly, sir. I think it's quite proper. I will take the liberty to tell you, sir, that it makes me what I am, and I am looked upon as a man who knows his work. It's a private affair of my own. A personal friend of mine in the French police gave me the hint that the fellow was an embassy spy. Private friendship, private information, private use of it. That's how I look upon it." The Assistant Commissioner, after remarking to himself that the mental state of the renowned chief inspector seemed to affect the outline of his lower jaw, as if the lively sense of his high professional distinction had been located in that part of his anatomy, dismissed the point for the moment with a calm, "I see." Then, leaning his cheek on his joined hands, "Well then, speaking privately if you like, how long have you been in private touch with this embassy spy?" To this inquiry, the private answer of the chief inspector, so private that it was never shaped into audible words, was, "Long before you were even thought of for your place here." This, so to speak, public utterance was much more precise. "I saw him for the first time in my life a little more than 7 years ago, when 2 Imperial Highnesses and the Imperial Chancellor were on a visit here. I was put in charge of all the arrangements for looking after them. Baron Vartenheim was ambassador then. He was a very nervous old gentleman. One evening, 3 days before the Guildhall banquet, he sent word that he wanted to see me for a moment. I was downstairs, and the carriages were at the door to take the Imperial Highnesses and the Chancellor to the opera. I went up at once. I found the Baron walking up and down his bedroom in a pitiable state of distress, squeezing his hands together. He assured me he had the fullest confidence in our police and in my abilities, but he had there a man just come over from Paris, whose information could be trusted implicitly. He wanted me to hear what the man had to say. He took me at once into a dressing room next door, where I saw a big fellow in a heavy overcoat sitting all alone on a chair, and holding his hat and stick in one hand. The Baron said to him in French, 'Speak, my friend.' The light in that room was not very good. I talked with him for some 5 minutes, perhaps. He certainly gave me a piece of very startling news. Then the Baron took me aside nervously to praise him up to me, and when I turned round again, I discovered that the fellow had vanished like a ghost. Got up and sneaked out down some back stairs, I suppose. There was no time to run after him, as I had to hurry off after the ambassador down the great staircase, and see the party started safe for the opera. However, I acted upon the information that very night. Whether it was perfectly correct or not, it did look serious enough. Very likely, it saved us from an ugly trouble on the day of the imperial visit to the city. Some time later, a month or so after my promotion to chief inspector, my attention was attracted to a big burly man I thought I had seen somewhere before, coming out in a hurry from a jeweller's shop in the Strand. I went after him, as it was on my way towards Charing Cross, and there, seeing one of our detectives across the road, I beckoned him over, and pointed out the fellow to him, with instructions to watch over his movements for a couple of days and then report to me. No later than next afternoon my man turned up to tell me that the fellow had married his landlady's daughter at a registrar's office that very day at 11:30 a.m., and had gone off with her to Margate for a week. Our man had seen the luggage being put on the cab. There were some old Paris labels on one of the bags. Somehow I couldn't get the fellow out of my head, and the very next time I had to go to Paris on service, I spoke about him to that friend of mine in the Paris police. My friend said, "From what you tell me, I think you must mean a rather well-known hanger-on and emissary of the Revolutionary Red Committee. He says he is an Englishman by birth. We have an idea that he has been a good few years now a secret agent of one of our foreign embassies in London." This woke up my memory completely. He was the vanishing fellow I saw sitting on a chair in Baron Vartenheim's bathroom. I told my friend that he was quite right. The fellow was a secret agent, to my certain knowledge. Afterwards, my friend took the trouble to ferret out the complete record of that man for me. I thought I had better know all there was to know, but I don't suppose you want to hear his history now, sir. The Assistant Commissioner shook his supported head. "The history of your relations with that useful personage is the only thing that matters just now," he said, closing slowly his weary, deep-set eyes, and then opening them swiftly with a greatly refreshed glance. "There's nothing official about them," said the Chief Inspector bitterly. "I went into his shop one evening, told him who I was, and reminded him of our first meeting. He didn't as much twitch an eyebrow. He said that he was married and settled now, and that all he wanted was not to be interfered in his little business. I took it upon myself to promise him that, as long as he didn't go in for anything obviously outrageous, he would be left alone by the police. That was worth something to him, because a word from us to the customs house people would have been enough to get some of these packages he gets from Paris and Brussels opened in Dover, with confiscation to follow for certain, and perhaps a prosecution as well at the end of it. That's a very precarious trade, murmured the Assistant Commissioner. Why did he go in for that? The Chief Inspector raised scornful eyes dispassionately. Most likely got a connection. Friends on the continent. Amongst people who deal in such wares. They would be just the sort he would consort with. He's a lazy dog, too, just like the rest of them. What do you get from him in exchange for your protection? The Chief Inspector was not inclined to enlarge on the value of Mr. Verloc's services. He would not be much good to anybody but myself. One has got to know a good deal beforehand to make a use of a man like that. I can understand the sort of hint he can give, and when I want a hint, he can generally furnish it to me. The Chief Inspector lost himself suddenly in a discreet, reflective mood, and the Assistant Commissioner repressed a smile at the fleeting thought that the reputation of Chief Inspector Heat might possibly have been made in a great part by the secret agent Verloc. In a more general way of being of use, all our men of the Special Crimes Section on duty at Charing Cross and Victoria have orders to take careful notice of anybody they may see with him. He meets the new arrivals frequently, and afterwards keeps track of them. He seems to have been told off for that sort of duty. When I want an address in a hurry, I can always get it from him. Of course, I know how to manage our relations. I haven't seen him to speak to 3 times in the last 2 years. I drop him a line, unsigned, and he answers me in the same way at my private address. From time to time, the Assistant Commissioner gave an almost imperceptible nod. The Chief Inspector added that he did not suppose Mr. Verloc to be deep in the confidence of the prominent members of the Revolutionary International Council, but that he was generally trusted. Of that there could be no doubt. Whenever I've had reason to think there was something in the wind, he concluded, I've always found he could tell me something worth knowing. The Assistant Commissioner made a significant remark. He failed you this time. Neither had I wind of anything in any other way, retorted Chief Inspector Heat. I asked him nothing, so he could tell me nothing. He isn't one of our men. It isn't as if he were in our pay. No, muttered the Assistant Commissioner. He's a spy in the pay of a foreign government. We could never confess to him. I must do my work in my own way, declared the Chief Inspector. When it comes to that, I would deal with the devil himself, and take the consequences. There are things not fit for everybody to know. Your idea of secrecy seems to consist in keeping the chief of your department in the dark. That's stretching it perhaps a little too far, isn't it? He lives over his shop? Who, Verloc? Oh yes, he lives over his shop. The wife's mother, I fancy, lives with them. Is the house watched? Oh dear, no. It wouldn't do. Certain people who come there are watched. My opinion is that he knows nothing of this affair. How do you account for this? The Assistant Commissioner nodded at the cloth rag lying before him on the table. I don't account for it at all, sir. It's simply unaccountable. It can't be explained by what I know. The Chief Inspector made those admissions with the frankness of a man whose reputation is established as if on a rock. At any rate, not at this present moment. I think that the man who had most to do with it will turn out to be Michaelis. You do? Yes, sir, because I can answer for all the others. What about that other man supposed to have escaped from the park? I should think he's far away by this time, opined the Chief Inspector. The Assistant Commissioner looked hard at him, and rose suddenly, as though having made up his mind to some course of action. As a matter of fact, he had that very moment succumbed to a fascinating temptation. The Chief Inspector heard himself dismissed with instructions to meet his superior early next morning for further consultation upon the case. He listened with an impenetrable face, and walked out of the room with measured steps. Whatever might have been the plans of the Assistant Commissioner, they had nothing to do with that desk work, which was the bane of his existence because of its confined nature and apparent lack of reality. It could not have had, or else the general air of alacrity that came upon the Assistant Commissioner would have been inexplicable. And as soon as he was left alone, he looked for his hat impulsively and put it on his head. Having done that, he sat down again to reconsider the whole matter. But as his mind was already made up, this did not take long, and before Chief Inspector Heat had gone very far on the way home, he also left the building. End of chapter 6.